Welcome. I'm Katie Wong of SFU Public Square. On behalf of Simon Fraser University, I would like to welcome you to the 2017 BMO Public Lecture, Why Culture Matters on the Need for a New Economics Model. The Bank of Montreal Lecture Series brings distinguished academics and speakers to SFU to give public lectures on topics of interest to the community. This event is sponsored in partnership with the Bank of Montreal, SFU Alumni Association, SFU Economics, and SFU Public Square. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are privileged to be gathered here this evening on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Let me now welcome Robert Weston, President of the SFU Alumni Association Board of Directors, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nathan Nunn.
Thank you, Katie. As the president of the Simon Fraser University Alumni Association, I'm really excited to be here tonight. The Alumni Association, representing as it does almost 150,000 SFU graduates that live and work in over 140 countries of the world, are really excited about offering these types of opportunities to alumni and the community in general to keep the university engaged with its alumni and its friends and neighbors. I also have a definite affinity for the economics department, as I graduated from SFU in economics some 40 years ago, and it was SFU that gave me the start to go to graduate school and then complete some 35 or more years in a career. So I owe a lot to the economics department of the university. Now, I feel particularly privileged tonight to be able to introduce to you Dr. Nathan Nunn. Last evening, I awarded him the Simon Fraser University Outstanding Alumni Award in the Rising Star category, and that is our association's most prestigious award, so congratulations. Dr. Nunn is Frederick E. Abbey Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Dr. Nunn was born in Canada, and last night I learned from Vanderhoof, a town not much smaller than where I started, and he later received his PhD from the University of Toronto in 2005. His primary research interests are economic history, economic development, cultural economics, political economy, and international trade. The International Monetary Fund named Dr. Nunn as one of the 25 economists under 45 who are shaping the way we think about our global economy. I know you will find his lecture really stimulating, and I'm also going to introduce Dr. David Jacks, Associate Chair of the Department of Economics, who will be joining later on the stage to moderate the discussion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nathan Nunn.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Everyone can hear me? Yeah? So it's a great honor to be here. And basically, for the next 45 minutes, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the research that I've been doing for the last 5, 6, 7 years. And so hopefully you'll find it interesting. So let's get to it. Simple question. Should I steal? Okay, so thought experiment. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I have a little dog, black dog named Max. I walk, me or my wife walks him every evening. There's an alleyway, and sometimes we cut through the alleyway. It's behind a school that's off of our road. So the simple thought experiment is you're going through the alleyway, you come across someone. The someone, you're pretty certain that they have money on them, and should you steal from them? Okay? And so this is part of what economics cares about, predicting human behavior. And what would be the standard economic model? So this would be Economics 101. And the traditional answer, well, you need to know what's the benefit from stealing. Okay, so how much money does that person really have on them? You need to know the cost that I incur if I'm caught. So what are the laws? And for how long does one go away for trying to mug somebody? And what's the probability of getting away with it? Okay, so if I attempt to steal from this person, what's the probability I'm successful and I'm never caught? I'll live the rest of my life for free. Once you know these three things, it's very simple, some nice algebra. The probability of getting away with it times the benefit, so how much money I actually get, But also there's a cost, and it's the probability, or so you subtract the cost, the probability I don't get away with it, that's 1 minus the probability I get away with it, times the cost. So is this greater or less than 0? If it's greater than 0, you steal. If it's less than 0, you don't steal. Okay? And so this makes a lot of sense. This puts some structure, right? We're taking a stand on how people make decisions. And so let's just do the following thought experiment. It's now you walking through the alleyway, okay? You know that the person has, let's say with certainty, so this is just a thought experiment, with certainty they have a $10 bill on them, okay? And let's set pi to 0. What's the probability you'll be caught is 0, okay? And so what does this whole thing equal? It equals $10. So how many of you would steal from, let's say it's an elderly woman, that, how many of you would steal from her? Okay, so what if it was $20, $22? Okay, so well, what if it was $1 million? I won't ask because some people might put up their hands. Okay, and so you can think about this. So the strict economic model would say, well, if it was 1 cent, you would do it, right? If it was $1, if it was a loonie, you would do it. So we could see that, well, maybe that doesn't always predict behavior. Okay, so this is just very anecdotal. And so that's the typical economic model. We're rational. We don't actually make that calculation in our heads, but we act as if we're making that calculation in our heads so that when we have economic models like this, that predicts behavior. Okay? So in other words, individuals act as if they're rational. Okay? Okay, so that was a thought experiment. You might think, well, that's not fair. And maybe people don't answer honestly. You guys would have all really mugged the lady for $10, but you didn't put up your hands because you feel bad. Well, let's actually look at some more formal analysis of the rational model, okay, and so some testing. So one way to test this is just have a thought experiment, but actually have it be real, okay? And so the way this has been done is in laboratories like the ones shown. So you're in this little cubicle, nobody's watching you, it's all automated, and you have a decision that's being made. So the decision in this case, this is one of the simplest, is let's say you're given $10, okay? So you're given $10, you're gonna have that. Once you leave the setting, you're gonna be given that in an envelope. No one's gonna know how much is in the envelope. But in the game, you're asked, well, how much of this would you like to give to someone else? This is one shot. You don't know the other person. The other person doesn't know you. The person won't know whether you gave them money, et cetera, et cetera. And what does the rational model predict? I won't even put up the math, but $10 is better than $0. $10 is better than $9. So you're going to keep all of it. You're not going to give any to the other person. Okay? So what do people do in reality? Well, most people give about half or just under half to the other person. Okay? And so that violates rational model of human behavior. Okay? So there should be no benefit. The person doesn't know who you are. You don't know who they are. There's no way they're going to find out. So it's a bit more of a slightly more complicated game. So let me take you through this. This is called the Ultimatum game. So it's 2 stages. There's a player 1. So the big picture thing is we have $100 or $10. We're going to decide how to divide that between 2 players. Again, it's all anonymous. It's one shot. Nobody knows who the other player is. And what happens is the first player is going to make an offer. It says, how about you get $5, I get $5. Okay, and then that's sent to the player 2. It's all anonymous. Player 2 says, okay, I like that. If the player says, I like that, they get that amount of money. But player 2 can also say, I don't like that. If the player says, I don't like that, they both get 0. Okay? And so that's it. One person makes an offer. The other person says yes or no. Yes, you get the offer. No, you both get 0. Okay? And so what does economic theory predict? Player 1 is going to offer to player 2 the lowest amount possible. In this example, we set it at 1 cent. Okay? And player 2 is going to accept that. 1 cent is better than 0 cents, right? And so that's going to be in equilibrium, the outcome. Player 1 offers 1 cent to the other player. Player 2 says, okay, that's pretty good. I'll take it. In reality, what happens, player 1 offers 50%. That's the typical offer. And people in general accept that. If player 1 tends to offer something lower, like player 2 gets 20%, they tend to reject that, right? And so you can see, well, it makes sense that they're going to offer 50% if they know the other person's going to reject it. But rejecting it doesn't make any sense at all, right? 20% of $10 is better than $0, okay? So again, the rational economic model fails, okay? So just as an aside, do we ever see behavior that is rational? Does anyone know the answer to this? So think of the ultimatum game, for example. Do we ever, so 50% is way off of 0 or 1 cent, right? Do we ever see? So it turns out there is one population, chimpanzees, okay? So the rational economic model is very good at predicting the behavior of chimpanzees. So I won't go into the details of this. This is a recent science article by, but this is the setup, basically. You can't explain to chimpanzees and tell them how to use the computer, but you can set up a series of rods where one person pulls one distribution, the other, or one chimpanzee, the other chimpanzee pulls it further so that they both get it. So chimpanzees basically, even if offers are really, really unfair, they'll accept them. And they'll say, okay, 1 grape is better than no grapes. And so that's fine. Okay, so I could go through many, many more examples, and I think throughout the talk you'll see more examples of this, but this raises the question of, well, why does the rational model fail? Okay? And why are individuals taking actions that aren't in their material best interest or in their best interest? And I think with the ultimatum game, dictator game, you can kind of get a sense of what the answer is there something else besides just the money that's motivating their actions, right? So what else is motivating people's actions? Okay, so to understand this and to think about, well, what does a more accurate or maybe more realistic model of human behavior look like, it's important to start with the following fact. We have cognitive limits, okay? So I guess maybe some of us more so than others, but we're all very limited in our cognitive ability. We don't know everything. Processing information is difficult and it's costly. And so even in normal everyday life, we're overloaded with information that can't all be processed, okay? So this might seem obvious, but you say, oh, who cares really? Does this really matter? So here's a stark example. So this is, 2 psychologists, this is a paper from 1999, Daniel Simmons and Christopher Chabris. This is something called the invisible gorilla. So basically what they had is, participants do, is watch a video. So this is a video, this is just a still from the video. There's 3 people dressed in white, you can see, 3 people dressed in black, okay? And the 3 people in white pass the ball to each other. The 3 people in black pass the ball to each other. And they asked participants to do something very, very simple, is count how many times the people in white pass the ball to each other, okay? Turned out the answer was 16 times. It was about 2 minutes. I've played this for my grad students at Harvard, PhD students, and this, I think, exemplifies the fact that we have cognitive limits. Every year, half of them get that wrong. So they can't count how many times people are passing the ball. So that shows one thing. That wasn't the point of this. Halfway through the video, an individual in a gorilla outfit walks across the video. You can see this is a still. The gorilla bangs his or her chest and then leaves. So after this, people are counting, and they ask, did you see the gorilla? And half the people say no, okay? So I think this exemplifies we have cognitive limits. Even the simple fact of seeing the world, you're not even making a decision, you're not even doing anything actively, just seeing the world, not everyone can do that, okay? So you might say, well, why is that? Maybe some people were looking really closely at the ball and their eyes literally didn't see the gorilla. It turns out that's not what happened, okay? So there was a follow-up study in 2006 where they actually used eye tracking technology. So you could track and see what people saw. People that consciously saw the gorilla and people that didn't see the gorilla both looked at the gorilla for the same amount of time, between 1 and 2 seconds, okay? And so it wasn't that they didn't see the gorilla, but what happened was that they didn't process the information that was coming in at them, okay? So we really literally can't process all the information that's coming at us visually. And one piece of evidence for this is people who had experience playing basketball and for which basically following the ball and counting was easier, they were more likely to have seen the gorilla. So they didn't have this cognitive load, basically, and they had more mental capacity to notice other things, okay? Okay, so what does that have to do with anything? We have cognitive shortcuts, so what? So that was something very simple, but imagine complex decisions that you're making in everyday life. Our ancestors had to do this. So in the face of these limits, I think what has happened, and lots of people think what's happened, we've developed shortcuts, right? So very quick and easy ways of making decisions. And so you think of these as rules of thumb, gut feelings. Religion is a shortcut, for example. And they might not always be perfectly correct. So for example, we felt bad when we mugged that lady, or when we even thought about mugging that lady. That's bad because we could have got $10 and that's going to be better. But there are benefits to having a heuristic or these feelings where you feel bad when you do harm to others, right? And so this is what I'm going to call culture. And so going back to the model, what was missing at the very beginning was, well, there are values, beliefs, preferences that are missing from that model. We feel bad when we take this action versus that action. It's just not a pure material calculation, okay? And so here's just some examples, because this is a bit abstract. And these are actually examples which I'm either going to talk about or others have done research on. So is it okay for women to work outside the home? So you might think, oh, of course, but there's a lot of societies where it's believed if the mother works outside the home, the children are going to suffer, okay? And you see that women tend not to work outside the home, okay? And so I think that decision is based on values of what you think is right or wrong, as much or more than a rational calculation, okay? Is it okay for people to marry their second cousins? So in our society, we would have this reaction that, oh, of course not. In many other societies, and societies historically, it's much, much better to marry your cousin, right? It kind of keeps the kin network more tight. It forms alliances. So what about second cousins? So is that okay? And then what about seventh cousins, okay? So it turns out that the Catholic Church banned marriage of seventh cousins during the medieval period, okay? Are sons better than daughters? Okay, so we know our answer, that's not going to be universal. Is the firstborn son, which I am, better than subsequent sons? Should fathers be more supportive of their nieces and nephews or of their own children? So you might think that's really, really strange. Of course, your own children. In matrilineal societies, fathers or individuals are obliged to support their nieces and nephews, their sisters' children, more than their own children. Okay? Can strangers be trusted? Okay, I think there might be a lot of heterogeneity in the room about the extent to which people think that that's the case. Can family members be trusted? Should people share money they've worked hard to earn? Again, so if someone else is down on their luck, how obligated do you feel to share with them? Okay. So I was going to give you a few more examples. So that provides, basically I want to provide some sense about how important are these gut feelings, these heuristics, these beliefs for decision making. So we have a bit of a natural experiment. A guy named Phineas Gage, this is in the 19th century, was working on the railway. He basically blew up rocks, and the way he did that was you drilled a hole, you put in some gunpowder into the hole, and then you tamped down the gunpowder with this rod that he's holding, and then you blew up the rock. Okay? So he was doing this, and then what happened was the rock blew up while he was tamping it down and went through his skull and went in this direction here. It was a miracle that he survived. But the rod basically went down in this direction up here, okay? So it damaged his brain, and basically it turned out that he wasn't able to function very well in daily life, okay? He wasn't able to make decisions, he made irrational decisions, et cetera, et cetera. And people really didn't know why, but this was a famous case. Subsequent psychologist Antonio Damasio has studied this. And in the more modern era, what we have is people with brain lesions, which are in the same place of the brain that was damaged in the case of Phineas Gage. And what he found after doing a series of tests is it wasn't that the case that these people weren't logical, that they weren't rational, right? But what they really lacked was emotion, right? And these people exhibited the same thing where they couldn't make decisions. They had a really hard time making decisions. And I think this example illustrates, so he had a patient who had these brain lesions and suffered from these problems. And basically, after the meeting, he said, okay, when do you want your next appointment? We have 2 appointments. Here's 2 dates. Which one would you like? And this is what happened. So for the better part of a half an hour, the patient enumerated reasons for and against each of the 2 dates. Previous engagements, proximity to other engagements, meteorological conditions, virtually anything that one could think of concerning a date. He was now walking through a tiresome cost-benefit analysis and endlessly outlining and fruitless comparison of options and possible consequences. Okay? It's a bit ironic because the cost-benefit analysis is same terminology that you use for economic models. And the idea here is to actually do those calculations if you don't have these gut feelings is actually quite difficult, right? And this is telling you the processing. He had to think of all different contingencies. What's the probability that this will occur or that will occur? And he was really just kind of frozen, wasn't able to make the decision, okay? Okay, and so the second thing I just want to talk about is tradition allows you to know the unknowable, okay? So that's not a typo. This is an example. So this is traditional processing of maize in Latin America. So you take dried corn, dried maize, you boil it for 40 minutes, and then you're going to take it out of the water, strain it, and then mash it up into dough or masa, and then have tortillas or other kind of yummy food. But what you do before you boil it is you put a bunch of ash in the water, or you put some certain types of dirt in the water. And no one really knew why. They said, oh, it tastes better, or this is the way my grandmother taught me, this is the way my mother taught me. So it turns out if you have a diet that's primarily maize, which societies that had this method were, that you'll get something called pellagra. So maize doesn't have enough niacin. You'll get skin rashes, dementia, and then you'll die if it's bad enough. And it turns out this is called alkali processing. It breaks down the existing amount of niacin that's in the corn and allows your body to absorb it. And that's because there's lime, basically, in the water. So an alkali base solution is formed. And nobody knew why. So it was just that this evolved in those places. And then there's a 1974 Science article that documents exactly where it was beneficial is where this cooking method formed. And there's lots of other examples of food cultures having this characteristic. So what's happening, basically, is through an evolutionary process, beneficial cultural traits are being passed on from one generation to another generation, okay? And what do you need for this to work? Well, the belief that it's important to do things the way your parents did, or the belief that tradition is important, and by doing that, you can actually do better than someone who is rational. So a rational person would have never been able to figure this out, right? So even an example of this is maize is indigenous to the Americas. Columbus discovers the Americas. Maize is brought back to Europe, northern Italy, Lesotho, even the southern US, which didn't have maize prior. And people, particularly poor people, start eating a ton of maize. But the culture, the technology was not brought back, right? And so people developed pellagra. They didn't know why. They thought it was because the maize was moldy. And it wasn't until much, much later, 1930, that they actually eventually figured this out, okay? Okay, so that's just trying to give you some sense of, well, it's important to think about feelings in decision making, or what we can call culture, or knowledge about traditions. And I think thinking along these lines has given risen to a few fields. One is behavioral economics. Another one is cultural economics, which I think is thinking along these lines. And it's examined the following questions, and this is for the rest of the talk about what I'll go through and talk to you about. So the first is, does culture exist, right? Do we really have these feelings within us which affects our behavior? And if so, where are there differences? And that's part of observing culture. And if so, where do these differences come from? Okay. And then do these matter for anything that economists care about? So I remember talking to an advisor in grad school. He said, oh yeah, that's probably true that we really don't act rationally, but that doesn't affect anything we care about as economists. Okay, so that's true. If that's true, then someone else can study it. I won't, but economists shouldn't be bothered. Okay, I don't think that's true. And also, what implications does this have for policy? So what? Even if economists study this, they understand the world better. What about policymakers? What about governments? Right? What about people in the real world? Okay, so does culture exist? So an easy way to do this is just to ask people, do you think it is right for, fill in the blank, for married women to also work? Do you think it's right for people to trust others? How do you feel about should others? So you can just ask survey questions like this, okay? Another way is to actually have these behavioral experiments. So the Ultimatum game was an example. And so what you're doing is you're bringing people from different cultural backgrounds into the same decision and seeing, do they behave systematically different? Do people from one society, are they more or less likely to give money in the Dictator game, right? than somebody from another society. Okay? So that's one way to do it. Another is natural experiments, right? So there are kind of natural settings in the world in which people from different settings come to a place and they play the same game, even if it's not an experiment that's set up by you. So I think a great example of this, there's many examples of this, is a study that studied professional soccer players in Europe, okay? And they said which players are more violent and which are less violent. So they call this a culture of violence. So which players got more red cards than other players? And it turns out this correlates strongly with whether you grew up in a country that's also violent, that experienced civil war when you were young, okay? And so that's just one natural setting. It's not the best, there's pros and cons compared to experiments, but that would be one setting that suggests maybe there is a culture of violence and people growing up in a violent setting are going to be more violent, okay? And here the game is literally a soccer game with the same rules, the same penalties to being violent. Okay, cross-cultural differences across societies. So the interesting thing is the ultimatum game, so remember that's where there's an offer and then accept or reject, was played across hundreds and thousands of times. And the typical offer, the most common offer, was always 50-50, okay? That all offer the other person 50, and then the other person would say yes, okay? So this was the case, and this was played by a number of economists. And I guess economists are lazy maybe like other people. It was always played with their students. So it's like, oh, let's play the game with our students, and they have to, or else they'll fail the class. And so this was until somebody who was, I guess, a little less lazy, a guy named Joseph Henrich, who was an anthropologist and a grad student. He was already going to these different field sites and playing and basically doing anthropological work, doing ethnographic work. And he said, this ultimatum game these economists are doing is kind of neat. Let's implement this amongst the Machigenga, who are these slash and burn horticulturalists. So that's Joe, seated here with some Machigenga participants. And what did he find? This is the first time a population didn't play 50-50, okay? And so here, this is from subsequent papers where he was even less lazy and did this amongst a large number of societies. But you can see the Machigenga here. The dot, the size of the dot represents the number of times that people chose that. So it's 30% offered to the other person and 20%. So you can see actually the Machigenga are much more rational than university students in Western schools, okay? And so this was played, as you can see, across a whole host of societies. And you can kind of see the size of the dots tells you the frequency of this. And then so Western societies would look similar to the Shona, for example. And so I won't go through this literature, but a lot of the literature has been talking about, can we document cross-cultural differences? But I think one thing I want to turn now to is, well, where do these differences come from? Okay. And so an interesting group on this graph is actually a group at the very top, the Lamalera. And you can see the bar that goes across tells you the average. So the average amount that the Lamalera offer to the other player is actually more than 50%. So you're offering for the other player, on average, to have more like 55, 56%, okay? So what is it about the Lamalera that makes them like this? You could say, well, it's just, we can't explain culture. It doesn't evolve systematically. Who knows? People, some people think this way, some people think this way. Another theory is, well, it evolves systematically and something determines it. So we look at the Lamalera. So they basically live on an island off the village of Indonesia. And they're a traditional whale hunting society. So this is actually today. So in general, even today, they don't use motorized boats, and they hunt whales in this manner with these giant long bamboo spears and some very brave young men. And what they do is they kill these whales, and then they share the food, right? So their ecology, their environment is one where, so if you lived here and this was your form of subsistence and you were super selfish, you wanted to work on your own, there's no way you could survive, right? So you have to be cooperative, you have to share your food when your young son helps kill the whale, and also you'll receive benefits, okay? And so this is telling you, I think, provides some suggestive evidence that the environment that a society grows up in or evolves in is possibly going to affect what cultural traits, what cultural values we see in equilibrium. Okay, so another one, gender. So everyone's always interested in this. The role of women around the world, this is super fascinating because we see huge heterogeneity. So this is female labor force participation around the world. The colors indicate differences. So red means above 70%. Green is 0 to 40%. So huge heterogeneity. And you might think, well, the answer is simple about what causes this. It's income, right? So as the US developed, then you have more opportunities for women, more demand for labor, and you have higher income. We saw that in the US, we saw that in Canada. But if you look at countries which have the highest rates of female labor force participation, countries with the lowest, they're both actually developing countries. And the countries with the highest are actually, I would say, on average, poorer than the countries with the lowest. Okay? So I don't think it's income, and income definitely doesn't explain things. This is some research I've done on my own or with others. Before that, these actual observed female labor force participation rates correlate highly with what people think is the right thing to do. Okay, so in countries where women don't work, if you ask people, they say women shouldn't work. That's women and men. Okay, and these are just the differences, and you can see these are some of the same countries. When jobs are scarce, should men have more rights to a job than women? Iceland, 3.6% of people say yes, so they say no. Egypt, 95%. You can see these other countries. Okay, so it's a huge variation, actually. So it turns out, again, this is some research I've done with co-authors, that this can be explained, a big chunk of this, so maybe 30% of this, by what technologies, that societies used hundreds of years ago, even thousands of years ago. So if we go far enough back in time, or that far back in time, prior to industrialization, vast majority of people were in agriculture. Okay? And there were two dominant forms of agriculture back then. One is plow agriculture, where the picture on your left is traditional plowing. And here the plow is an implement. It goes through the ground continuously. It overturns the soil, kills weeds, aerates the soil. Super, super efficient. It's often pulled by an animal. But what it requires is a lot of upper body strength. Okay? The other form of agriculture is called swidden agriculture, or slash and burn agriculture. And that's basically you'll burn some forest and you'll use a hoe, right? And so that's an example here. Okay? And so there are biological differences between men and women. So men tend to be stronger in their upper body, have stronger grip strength. Men do not bear children. And I think because of that, women in most societies tend to be the ones that look after children. Okay? So this, I think, illustrates it in this case that in this case, this requires a lot of upper body strength, a lot of physical strength. This type of agriculture is more compatible with childcare. Okay? So it doesn't mean that women could not work in plow societies and that men could not work in here, but you did have these little differences that caused men to specialize in agriculture here and women in these types of societies. Okay? And then over time, basically, that became normal, right? In societies, the Western society is an example of this, or Western European societies, where women tended to work within the home and men outside the home. Okay? Then over time, in African societies or other societies, Latin American societies that used the hoe, that basically women worked outside the home just as much. Okay? So these basically underlying technologies then caused a gender division of labor, which became seen as normal. And it turns out you see that even today, even outside of agriculture. So we've moved outside of agriculture. We're in manufacturing, and these norms or these values also carry over into education. And so you might think, what determines whether one uses the hoe or the plow? Well, it has to do with agricultural conditions and also what types of crops you grow. Okay, so I won't go into that, but so another piece of research I've done is looking at the slave trades in Africa. So the slave trades are this very large trade in human beings. 20 million people were taken from the continent in Africa and were brought to basically the destinations shown, which is the Americas as well as the Middle East. And so this is something I started to research in graduate school. An amazing thing, once you get to the very micro level and ask, how was it that these people became enslaved? So first, it wasn't Europeans going in and enslaving them. Europeans really couldn't go on land because they would die of malaria or yellow fever. And sometimes it was one society raiding another society, but actually a big chunk of the time it was friends and family members turning on each other. Okay, so this is one sample of 144 people. A linguist named Sigismund Kelle, who was a German linguist, basically was interested in their language, documenting their language, and he asked, oh, by the way, how is it that you became a slave? And so if you just go through the documents and look at this, you find that 20% were sold or tricked by a relative or a friend. Okay? So basically the slave trade created this dynamic where people had to turn on one another in order to protect themselves. So in order to protect yourself, you needed guns or iron. Most societies didn't have these. So how did you get them? You traded with the Europeans. What did Europeans wanted? Well, they only wanted slaves. So in order to get these things to protect yourself, you had to turn on somebody, okay? And maybe the day before, you just happened to have a fight with your best friend. You're mad at them anyways, so why not talk to a slave merchant and said, okay, my friend's going to be coming down the road. At this time, we'll grab him. Okay, so that was very, very, very common. Okay. So the analysis basically looked at how many slaves or how intensively did each of 800 different ethnic groups within Africa experience the slave trade. And it turns out in places or amongst ethnic groups that experience the slave trade more severely, people today report, when you ask them these survey questions, that they trust their friends less. They trust their family members less, okay? Even though the slave trade ended 100 years ago, okay? And that makes complete sense that basically if you have these norms of distrust, you're going to do a lot better during this environment of the slave trade, okay? Or maybe you'll adopt these norms of distrust. Okay, so those are a few examples of long-run determinants. We're talking like hundreds of years or thousands of years. And there's actually a lot of work that's looking at shorter-run determinants, okay? So just very quickly, Giuliano and Spilimbergo, basically they look at individuals. If you basically entered university during a recession, right? Then years later in adulthood, you have stronger preferences for redistribution. Okay, so it turns out psychologically these are formative years. You see a recession, you see a lot of people who are having a hard time. It's not because they're lazy, but it's just because of bad luck. So then you think, oh, well, we need redistribution. Violence and conflict. There's been a lot of work done on parts of the world that experience civil wars. Turns out what happens when you experience a civil war or conflict is people bond together within the community. They feel closer to community members, altruism kind of emerges, and this kind of can often permanently increase the cohesion and good feelings within a community. There's a study done by 2 economists, which basically they wanted to ask, what is the impact of 4th of July? This is a socialization activity. Plausibly, it could cause you to become more patriotic. And basically what they do is they have this neat trick where if you just looked at the correlations in the data, you would see people that go to 4th of July activities, they're more patriotic, okay? So that means 4th of July causes patriotism, right? So no, everyone, right? Because it's going to go the other way around. So how do we get a causal effect from 4th of July to patriotism? Well, the way we do this is we look and see, did it rain on the 4th of July or on the 4th of Julys when you were growing up, okay? And basically 4th of July activities are all outdoors, barbecue, fireworks, parades. If it rained, that's exogenous, right? The individual's not causing this. But if it rains, then you're less likely to attend that, and then we can see what things look like when you're old, okay? And so he finds a causal effect that if you're if it rained on the 4th of July, so you did not attend those activities, you're less patriotic, you're less likely to vote, and you're actually less democratic, right? Or so if you attended 4th of July activities, then you're more Republican, it turns out. Okay. So I don't know that he had priors on that, but yeah. So the Democrats really did not like that finding. Okay. So that's just telling you a little bit about, I think culture exists. It evolves in a systematic manner. And it's influenced by our environment, by external shocks, and there is a logic to it. Okay. So I think another natural question is, well, that's fine. Do we care about any of this stuff? So hopefully female labor force participation we care about. But I can give you another example, which I think is even more stark. So this is a village in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. So it's a village that I visited in March of 2015. And basically the village, when we had gotten there, had become liberated from local Hutu militia. So this is an area close to Rwanda. So after the genocide in 1994, a lot of Hutu militia came in. They were terrorizing a lot of the villages. Okay? So we went there. They had become liberated. And we asked them, well, what's the story? How was it that you became liberated? So they told us, okay, well, 2 years earlier, there was an elderly man. He had a dream. And the dream was, or in the dream, he was informed or told of how he could make all the individuals in the village bulletproofed. Okay? And so he told everyone about this. They believed that they were bulletproofed. Okay? And then they rose up and fought against the Hutu militia. Okay, so they had machetes, but the Hutu militia had AK-47s. Okay? But through perseverance, they were able to eventually kill enough Hutu militia, get guns, and then that cycle continued until they were able to defend themselves. Okay? So you might think, well, how was this possible? So one is they had to have a bit of faith, and this is a cultural belief, a faith in the traditions and the values, and this is not uncommon in this area. The other thing that the bulletproofing had was a number of conditions. Okay? So conditions like if you ate cucumbers, it was invalidated. If you drank rainwater, it was invalidated. If you were within 10 meters of a menstruating woman, it was invalidated. So a few things. And so if you're running through the jungle with your machete and the guy next to you got shot, then you think, oh, he must have had a cucumber yesterday, or he, drank rainwater. And so it's very clear when rainwater, which fell, and there's no plumbing here, when it changes from rainwater to river water, so a bit of ambiguity there. But I think that had, but the amazing thing here is through these beliefs, right? So these are values and beliefs that I believe in these, a traditional religion, right? That actually this can have huge impacts. So this has huge welfare implications, put it in economic terms, that this society had been freed and has been freed for the last 3 years, okay? And maybe not surprisingly, this isn't the only village where people realize that they can become bulletproofed. Okay, so it's actually then subsequently it became very, very common. You can kind of see, well, there is a benefit actually for everyone banding together and maybe being overly optimistic about how invincible they are. Okay, so another example. So this is childhood stunting in India. Okay, so it turns out, so India's developed remarkably quickly in recent years. Okay, so income has been going up dramatically. Despite this, children are still undernourished, and children are still much, much shorter than they should be. Okay, so this is just a few figures from the UN. Almost 40% of children in India suffer from stunting. Okay, so that's a lot. And it turns out, even though India is extremely developed, this is kind of amongst the worst. Okay. Something like Congo, this is the Republic of Congo, is 52nd, very, very poor, $250 a year average per capita income, and India is much, much lower than that. Okay? So why is it? And so the standard answers by development economists is, well, we need to feed them more. But it seems like they have enough food, actually. So that's a striking thing. Other countries that have less food, you don't have as much stunting. So what's going on? So this is a brand new paper that's just published this week. So what Seema Jayachandran, Rohini Pande did was basically, let's compare Africa to India. Okay, that's where you see these stark differences. Africa, much poorer, but they don't have stunting. India, much richer, but they do. And let's look at cultural characteristics that could explain this. So it turns out in India, you have a very strong first son preference. Okay, so remember that question about should the first son be treated a lot better than the other sons? There, the belief is yes. Okay? The other thing you have is a male preference. Okay? Should sons be treated better than daughters? The belief is yes. Okay? And in Africa, you don't have that, right? Not nearly as strong. So what happens? Well, the first male son, the eldest male son, gets a ton of food. That means less food is left over for the other children. Okay? And they're stunted. Okay? Whereas maybe you would have less stunting, everyone would have enough if you gave everyone some minimal amount. Okay? And the other thing is, if you have a family that's, let's say your first 3 kids are daughters, right? You've had bad luck. Then you're going to have another kid. Let's say that's a daughter. You're going to have even another kid. And so families that girls are in tend to be really, really large. Because if you had a lot of daughters, you're going to keep trying, right? And so that's another thing that happens. Because of this first son preference, you really want to have a son. And so families tend to be larger than maybe what is optimal, okay? So again, this is something that's not obvious. You think, oh, stunting, that just means enough food. That's super easy. Why do we have to think about culture? But here, culture plays an important role. And I think we care about children's health as economists, as heartless as we are. Yeah. So another example about India, which is not obvious, is food cultures. So everybody growing up, you have a certain type of food, and you come to like that food, and maybe you dislike other foods, or maybe you don't, but you really kind of have an affinity to food that you're brought up in. In India, it's a very big country. There's different types of foods in different parts of the country. So in southern India, it's primarily rice, northern India, wheat, and different vegetables as well. And in India, you also have a lot of migration across states. Okay? So this is a paper by David Atkin, an economist at MIT, and he basically documents when immigrants move from one state to another, what they tend to do is eat their old food. Okay? So that makes sense. But what if the food that you're used to is super hard to find, is a specialty item, and super expensive? Okay? And remember, this is India where we have a lot of stunting. Are you still going to insist on eating your old food, even if it means less money, or that basically you have less money or less resources for food in general? Okay? And basically what he shows is that's the case. Right? So even when you have children that are stunted, you still insist on eating your old basket of food or your old bundle of food when you move to a new location, even if it means less calories, right? Thanks. Okay, so in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about, well, what implications does this have for policy? Okay, and so this is actually, honestly, the stuff I've thought about the least. It's maybe the last year or so, but I think it might be potentially the most important. Okay. So I'll give you 3 examples: provision of health, fertilizer use, and education of girls. So a big issue in development economics is we've made all of these advances in medicine. So if there's one thing we know, it's how to make people healthier by going to the doctor or by giving them vaccines, polio vaccines, treating them with malaria, etc. But there are many high-profile cases of people in developing countries refusing Western medicine. Okay, so people donate money, they give their time, Doctors Without Borders, they go there, try and help them, and they say, no, 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 don't stick that needle in my kid. And why? And so this is an extreme example. Ebola, the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa, people were avoiding hospitals if they had Ebola. And one reason is because they thought Ebola was created by Western doctors, and it was a conspiracy theory in which they'd be killed. So, really, really distrustful of Western medicine. So you could say, well, that's completely irrational. I don't understand why these people think that, and they're not accepting the stuff that's good for them. So if you look back in the history of these places, what you had actually in the early 1900s were colonial medical campaigns. So here's 2 photos of examples from that. So basically, this is under colonial rule, so these populations don't have all the freedom that they would probably desire. Europeans come in. They're really trying to do good. They're trying to eradicate sleeping sickness, river blindness, malaria. So they line people up. These are communicable diseases, so it's important that everyone is on board. They line people up. They number them. So these are pictures for sleeping sickness. To diagnose sleeping sickness, you had to give people a spinal tap, so not a pleasant experience, but from their point of view, it was worth it. So line them up, force them at gunpoint, if necessary, to undertake these things. And actually, during this time, the main treatment was something called a toxal. And this is an arsenic, so basically arsenic-based drug. And so they thought, this seemed to kill sleeping sickness because it kills the parasite that's transmitted by the tsetse fly. So that's great. And they said, oh, well, it's pretty cheap. Let's just give it to everybody. So, yeah. So sometimes we'll give them spinal taps, but sometimes we'll go easy on them, and we'll give them a toxal. Turns out that a toxal created blindness in 20% of those treated. So it turns out we don't use this anymore, and subsequently it wasn't used. And this was actually one of the ways that we learned how to do this. And so you can actually think about, well, the people today that are refusing Western medicine and have developed a distrust of Western medicine, their parents and grandparents actually underwent these experiences. Okay? So actually 2 of my students said, well, let's see if that history of colonialism, and particularly this type of colonialism, had effects on distrust of Western medicine. And that can explain why people are refusing all of this great Western aid. And so what they did is looked at the intensity, and this is the number of visits, which is kind of staggering, 24 visits in some of these places, of these colonial medical campaigns. And you see exactly in these places where people were visited intensively that people have a distrust for Western medicine. And today, so that's what these graphs are showing. On the x-axis is times visited, and on the y-axis is basically people refusing HIV treatment or HIV diagnostics. Okay? And so people hear these stories, and there are actually traditional songs and poems about the Europeans coming and then doing these terrible things. They have this distrust. Effectively, they're saying, we've seen this before, and no thanks, we don't need this. Okay? And so, a rational calculation, they would have a different answer. But here, based on these heuristics on culture, they have a different answer. Okay, so for policy, what is this telling us? Well, we need to do more, and maybe educational campaigns, than just show up with this great technology and wonder why people aren't accepting it. Okay? And this actually tells you exactly where the information campaigns are more important, and where they are need to be more intensively administered. Okay? So another example is fertilizer use in Africa. So the quote here is from a famous agronomist, which is basically showing what the graph shows. The graph shows fertilizer consumption in different regions around the world. Here it's pretty much flat within Africa, whereas other places it's gone up, right? And agricultural production has gone up as well, where there's been fertilizer use. Okay? So basically the quote says, everyone else has adopted fertilizer, they can feed themselves, but not Africans. Okay? So it's a bit of a puzzle. So people have started to think about this. Well, why not Africans? A natural thing is, well, paying money for fertilizer, and then whether it works or not, some of it could be fake, that's risky. So maybe Africans aren't as much of risk takers. So they're more risk averse. So in this graph, which is from surveys by a number of economists, Arm and Falk and co-authors, red means they're less likely to take risks. Blue means they're more likely to take risks. Okay? And so you see that's not the case. Africans actually are very willing to take risks, at least according to these surveys. So maybe they're less patient, actually. Okay? So patience, dark blue is patient, red is less patient. We see us in Canada, we're very patient. Okay? Australians are very patient. Western Europeans are very patient. Africans aren't as patient, but they're not really different than Asians or Latin Americans. Okay? So that doesn't seem to explain it. And patience is important because you spend money today and you have to wait till the crop harvest. So a bit running out of time, I think this is interesting. There's a marshmallow experiment. So in Stanford's in the 1960s, an experiment to test patience. And so what they did with kids, about 4 years old, put a marshmallow in front of them or some other treat and said, if you wait 10 minutes, I'm going to put you in this room by yourself with the marshmallow. If you wait 10 minutes, you'll get 2 marshmallows. And they basically waited to see how long they could wait before eating the marshmallow or licking it or doing other things. And it turned out this was an incredibly good predictor of success later in life. Okay? So could you delay instantaneous gratification for a future reward? So this is a paper that came out in Science just this year. They did this. Again, this was primarily in European cultures, Western European cultures. They did this amongst a farming culture named the Nso in Cameroon. And this is a picture actually from the experiment. So it was a little tree. And these guys were off the charts. These kids were much, much more patient than even Germans, which was the comparison group. And basically just blew them out of the water. Okay? And so it's not that Africans are less patient, right? I think, so I think this makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've thought a little bit about this in the context of the DRC. And I'll just give you a little bit of the evidence that we're just starting to accumulate. So these are vignettes. These are stories. So the story is, imagine we are in a village outside of Kananga. This is a city in the DRC. The primary crop is maize. Imagine that one farmer named Matumbo has a maize harvest that is twice as large as other farmers in the village. So he could have used fertilizer, right? And now he has this great harvest. So what will others believe is the most likely reason for Matumbo's success? So these are the number of people, that's in the blue, that their answers. Okay, these are kind of open-ended, and then we categorize them. 65% say that it's because of the use of fetishes, witchcraft, or ancestors. 37 say hard work, so he cultivated good. Prayers or blessings, skill or good luck. Okay, so if you use fertilizer and then your neighbors think you're using witchcraft, that's probably not a good thing. Okay, so witchcraft is looked down upon, even though it's very common, and people often think witchcraft comes at a cost. So in order for you to benefit, you have to have cursed someone else. Okay, so in the same year, one of the other farmers has a particularly terrible harvest, and his crop is completely eaten by insects. How likely is that others will blame Mutombo for the ruined crop? In other words, I cursed my neighbor, and then I was able to get his benefits through this. And so 36% or 80%, 36 out of 165, 80, will say very likely or likely. So people will connect these two things, which are, to us, maybe not so connectable. Okay? So will other people in the village expect Mutombo to share some of his new wealth? So you can see most people say yes. Okay? And it's just different types of people. So that's the other thing is this culture of redistribution, of sharing. And will people sabotage Mutombo if he doesn't share? And you can see very likely or likely. Okay? And so this, I think, just provides some food for thought. What are the incentives to use fertilizer and have your crop be particularly exceptional in this setting? Okay? And this is something that development economists that are studying this really aren't thinking about. Okay? Okay, the very last thing, I'm minus 3 minutes here, is school construction in Indonesia. Okay, so Indonesia, 1973, they built 61,500 schools. Okay, biggest school, 61,807, I have it exactly there. Biggest school construction project ever of its kind. Okay, so great, we built these elementary schools, and once economists then evaluated this, what you saw is huge increase in the number of boys going to school, but no increase in the number of girls going to school. Okay? And actually, nobody wrote up that result about no increase in girls because, that's not that exciting. So this is in a paper with a few co-authors. We went back, revisited this, and it turns out the no effect on girls masks a huge amount of heterogeneity. In some societies, it had a huge impact. So schools were built and families sent their daughters to school. In other societies, they just didn't send their daughters to school. Why? Oh, and the other thing is we looked in Zambia, which also had a similar school construction project, exactly the same thing. Why? So it turns out to understand this, you have to understand marriage, which might not be obvious. So the marriage customs, in at least the subset of these societies, is something called a bride price. So this is when you get married. So you can think about our Western societies. When you get married, there's all these weird customs, things you wear, things you do. In some societies, these customs come with a transfer of wealth. So in bride price societies, the groom's parents pay money to the bride's parents. Okay? And so the important thing to understand, it turns out that if the daughter or the bride is more educated, then that money that's transferred is a lot higher. Okay, so elementary school education, it's doubled. High school, it's doubled. College, it's doubled. And we're talking 1 or 2 years income. Okay, so in bride price societies, parents basically realize, oh, there's a school down the street. I can send my daughter to school. If I do, right, I'll get this amount of money 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the line. Non-bride price societies, they didn't have this extra monetary incentive, and it's costly to send your daughter to school. She could be helping out, and so they didn't send it. Okay? So the important thing here for policymakers, and so this is just some data. You went and you can ask people what's the second most important, and it turns out there's an app, so you can download this right now as I'm speaking. Lobola is the word for bride price used in southern Africa, or the southern part of the continent of Africa. And you can have a calculator, and you can calculate your lobola. I've done this. It's 10 cows, which I was very, very proud of. And the second or third thing they ask is, what's your education? Okay, as well as how well can you cook, and are you a virgin, and these sorts of things. So that's proof that education is important. But the important thing here for policymakers is, with certain cultural traits, it's enough to just build schools, and then people will come. With other cultural traits, so without bride price, for example, just building schools isn't enough. Maybe you needed to subsidize, have a conditional cash transfer, provide free lunches, something else. Okay. Okay, so just to summarize, we have cognitive limits. I think this is the foundation of this all. Culture, these beliefs, value, religion provides a shortcut at decision making. It can be even better than rationality. And we observe cultural differences across societies. These things, I believe, evolve through a systematic process, through evolutionary forces. So we can see where the traits that are more beneficial are more likely to exist. They're important determinants of things we care about. Okay, so culture does matter for things economists care about, and even for policy. I think if we're like trying to improve the world, it helps to understand the people that you're trying to help, right? It helps to understand the cultural context, the way they think, the way they view the world. Okay, so that might seem really strange, but believe it or not, the World Bank and many development economists take a one-size-fits-all policy and says, here's our Western view, we're going to implement this, and then we're really annoyed if it's not working. Okay, and so that's a summary of what I've been thinking about for the last little while. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Jacks from the Department of Economics. I just want to personally thank Nathan very much for the great lecture. At this point, we're going to try to open up the discussion a bit and field some questions from the audience. A few things to kind of observe here. We have some volunteers circulating about with microphones. So if you do have a question, make sure that you actually use the microphone so that everyone in the room can actually hear you, along with Nathan. And also, please try to make your question as concise as possible to ensure that everyone actually has a chance if they want to ask a question as well, right? So, any takers? I see at least one brave volunteer over here. So.
Two things I learned from your lecture.
Okay.
One, I know why you're not stunted.
Okay. Yeah.
You're the firstborn.
Yeah.
The second thing was the biggest flaw in economic science is it's not based on rational thinking. It's based on culture.
The biggest flaw is that it is or is not.
It's not based on rational thinking. It's based on, like you said, it's not based on rational thinking. It's
Yeah.
based on culture.
That real life human behavior. Yeah. Okay.
We had Brian.
So a lot of this work has looked at the effect of culture on the things that we as Westerners care about. But of course, the culture, a lot of these cultural practices and beliefs are things that their society, that people value in and of themselves. Has there been any progress made in economics on incorporating people's valuation of their own culture into evaluation of policy or into decision making by governments?
No. So I don't think so. Even just the simple things I talked about, which wasn't trying to value culture per se, or even talk about welfare per se. So like the education thing, for example, is just, we want people to become educated. So that hasn't been done. And then another thing that's kind of interesting is, so that's within economics. In the real world, there are attempts to do things like this. So for example, in many societies, believe it or not, or maybe it's easy to believe, bride price is viewed very negatively. So it's viewed from the Western view is, grooms, when they're paying this money or their family's paying this money, they feel like they're buying the bride, right? And even bride price is a Western word. Bride wealth is actually the more common term. And that's not how they view it. They view it as a gift of appreciation for the parents of the daughter who's now leaving the daughter's house, or the parents' house, for putting all this effort into raising a great daughter. And that's why you give more money when the daughter's more educated, is because you put in more money, you invested more in the daughter. And so bride price is actually, it's attempting, governments are trying to get rid of it actually. And if it has these, without recognizing maybe it has these effects, right? Overall, what's the net, is it good or bad, and how do we value it? We're very, very far from that. But I think one thing that governments are doing is trying to get rid of stuff they haven't really thought about or done these economic analyses about. So witchcraft is another example. So definitely governments are trying to get rid of witchcraft. There's some bad things about it. But maybe the example shows that there might be some good things and it might have some value. And so, yeah.
Okay, so we had a question here.
Sure. Hello. Thank you,
Hi.
Dr. Nunn, for your presentation. It was fascinating. My name is William Hall. I'm from the University of British Columbia. I'm a student there. My question was kind of about whether you've seen examples, and you talked about the so what can we do about it?
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about maybe using additional incentives to try and get people to abandon, you could say, these traditional heuristics that have served them well over hundreds of years. I wonder if you've seen examples of that, and whether your recommendations, I mean, like a general recommendation would be to try and use additional incentives to override the traditional heuristics, or like you said, work with those, traditional things like witchcraft, or maybe give the fertilizer to the shaman or whoever it is, and say, maybe you could give this to people. So if you just wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so I think the easiest thing and most conservative thing would be exactly what you said last, was to work with the traditions. So when you go into a society, don't immediately impose the Western traditions, which are completely foreign to them, but instead say, oh, how do things function here? So just give you one example of a study we're doing in the Democratic Republic of Congo. When aid organizations come in, they typically have to work with the local chief. You need some cooperation, so you have to give them a little bit of autonomy. Maybe they're going to distribute goods. But the problem is the chief has an incentive to steal, right? And so what do Western organizations do? Well, let's set up a committee that's representative of the community. So let's make sure there's women on it. Let's make sure there's old people, young people on it. And let's even make it democratic and have voting and these sorts of things. But they've kind of missed that actually in many societies there are pre-existing organizations. So in the societies we're looking at, these are called age sets. So these are young men which have formed of the same age. And what these young men have traditionally been responsible for is overseeing the chief, right? In some sense, because they're young and healthy and they can protest and be aggressive if they need to. So villagers come to these young men and basically say, we're having these problems. And the young men as an age group, and they undergo initiation rituals, so they're very bonded, basically monitor the chief, right? So that's actually the exact opposite. There's a committee there already. It's just of one gender. In some cases, it's women, actually. Just one gender, and it's one homogenous age group, right? But the Western view is, oh, no, it has to be representative, and so you're completely ignoring. And so what we're looking at is, well, what if you just did the simple thing and just use their pre-existing traditions? Will you get less corruption, right? So that's just a simple thing. We're not trying to eradicate anything. No value judgment. It's just saying, well, let's actually learn a little bit about these societies and work with them. Yeah.
All right,
Hi, Nathan. Thank you very much. I actually heard you on CBC driving into Delta,
Oh, great.
and I'm glad I did. And I came here early, and all the seats were taken, but I came anyhow, hoping I'd get in, and I did. I actually came specifically because I am working on a project, and I'm hoping you can maybe speak to it. I'm actually working on a project. It's called Emerging African Entrepreneurs, and we go in and we actually educate and provide microfinancing for entrepreneurs in Africa. Now, I'm going to be going to take a role of entrepreneurship literacy into the school systems in East Africa. Based on your experience and suggestion of an education campaign for the adoption of Western medicine, based on that, what you mentioned earlier, what initial approach would likely work the best when it comes to education and entrepreneurship in East Africa?
Right. So, yeah. So I think the first thing I would do, and maybe you're already doing this, is sit down, have a lot of focus groups, and ask people the questions related to this. So, why? If people refuse Western medicine, why? Right. And so I think that's not done enough with NGOs. They don't have time to do this. They don't have often. And so if you're already doing that, that's great. Surveys would be great, so then you're not just getting a very small sample. And then just think creatively about the answers. So there's one study which is recent by an economist. What they did is they brought in a microscope, and they just had people come along, and they showed them germs under the microscope, right? So it's a very hard, like, why do you need to wash your hands? Who cares? And once you show them that's something tangible they can understand, they're like, oh, you're not just making up stories. This is actually something. And they found that increased, yeah. So that, you show them, you explain it to them. And so I think that's a bit more creative. I don't think that's regularly done. But I think really understanding why is it that people are doing this, what's the logic, I think is helpful. And so the context is super, super important. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question there.
So thank you for the amazing lecture. So my main question is how persistent culture is, but I just want to give one example. So there are a lot of societies where the participation of women labor force has increased over time because of industrialization or different positive correlations. So those, what do you think are the circumstances where the economic necessity of people triumphs their cultural norms? Where, for example, in a society where women were not working for years, thousands of years, just because of increased economic necessity that if they don't work, their family is not gonna have to starve tonight.
Yeah.
That economic necessity makes them work, overcoming that cultural norm.
Yeah.
So how persistent culture is.
Yeah. So I think it's definitely the case that culture is sticky, and that it evolves slowly, and sometimes it can evolve quickly in other times. But it also has a logic to it, right? So cultural traits that are more beneficial in terms of people have higher income, so they have more kids, or they're more successful, those cultural traits are going to do better. Either you'll have more kids, and they'll be passed on, or people will adopt that. They'll say, oh, that guy's really rich, so he's entrepreneurial and rich, I'm going to copy him. And so things like economic policies, which will increase the return to one cultural trait versus another, are going to, who knows how long it'll take, and that could vary, are going to affect these values and beliefs, right? And so economics does affect culture. Costs and benefits do affect culture, right? And so that's definitely the case. And just on the quick thing about how quickly does culture change or not, you can see with the example of maize, what made that cultural trait beneficial was that environment was very, very stable over a long period of time. When an environment is changing very quickly, then these cultural values that are passed on from one generation to another generation can become outdated. And I think in environments that are unstable, people then stop valuing tradition. So maybe you no longer are as religious as you were. And I think we see that in Western societies where there's been a huge amount of economic growth since the Industrial Revolution. And you can think that people value, plausibly, tradition less now than in the past. And that's kind of something you mentioned, where there's instability, and then maybe people are going to abandon culture. And it's because it's effectively not going to work as well as it would have in a stable environment, right? Yeah.
We had a question here from one of our...
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. I'm from Tanzania, and I worked, born there and worked for many years as medical statistician, but for Oxfam as well. You gave the example of schools where in Indonesia. The same thing happened in Mozambique and other. What I found and what others also found was that when the schools were built, they didn't build any latrines or washrooms. Mm-hmm. So the boys could pee anywhere, but women couldn't. Same in Vancouver. You don't find many washrooms. You can see.
And the boys pee everywhere.
Boys pee everywhere in the hot sun. So I was wondering, and also the issue of gender of teachers, because when there are teachers who are females, and especially in Indonesia, but even in Muslim, where the teachers who are females are highly valued, I was wondering if that factor is considered, because I've seen that the gender issue is ignored, and then you get, it's part of culture issues, and the economics go haywire, because most of the economics are also male-oriented or, anyway. So that's my question. And the second question was about the medical side. You said that there were certain ethnic groups or tribes who were not accepting Western medicine. Mm-hmm. But now there are a lot of African doctors who are trained. Same with indigenous doctors in Canada, where people are more respective and the indigenous doctors are respecting the indigenous culture. So I was wondering, because most of African countries have been independent now for 50 years. And poverty has increased, but thank you.
So
maybe you can comment.
On the second one, this is something we're very interested in studying in the Congo. There are Western doctors that are African, from Africa or African, or whatever country you're in, Congolese in our case. But there's also traditional doctors, so what we in the West would call witch doctors. And they both want to drum up business for themselves. And so they do, the witch doctors will trash talk Western doctors and vice versa, Western doctors. Sometimes you'll see an individual is very educated and has a foot in both and says, oh, I can understand the logic of both. And so, yeah, so that is a constant battle. And for people that have, you have a sick child, and do you take them to the Western doctor or a traditional healer? Traditional healer is typically a lot cheaper. Which do you decide? And this is an important public health issue. And on the first point, it's super important. Actually, there's a recent study by someone named Angelia Dukia, who's in Chicago Harris, basically where she looked at education of daughters, and whether they had female latrines was basically a huge determinant, right? And it's not like, you could think, oh, well, women could use the unisex, or girls could use the unisex latrine, but it's these cultural issues of shame, and you feel ashamed, and there's gender inequalities. And so that's exactly right. And that's part of, if you're from the outside, building schools, understanding the culture of the environment and being culturally sensitive, and then understanding what other things have to accompany this. So yeah, that's a good example.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nunn, for your insightful lecture. I'm also from the University of British Columbia, and I've heard amazing things about you in the department. My question is, I'm thinking knowledge about social norms and culture has been created or has been talked about before in, say, in disciplines like anthropology, geography.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, and there's also evidence to suggest that other social scientists, barring economists, are more likely to cite each other or take from each other's work. The sociologist is more likely to cite another geographer. But that doesn't extend in economics, where economists primarily cite other economists. So do you think this is largely a problem of the discipline, where we are not able to take knowledge from, say, other disciplines like anthropology or linguistics, or disciplines that primarily study culture, and incorporate them into our own work?
Yeah, so I think there's big scope, or large returns, or there's a lot of scope for cross-disciplinary communication. And I agree. The fact is, economists tend to talk to other economists. And so we could talk for a long time about why that is, and other disciplines. If there's one thing they can agree upon, it's that they dislike economists and are overconfident in our models and our statistics. But that's not everybody in every other discipline. But I think that's part of it. But I think definitely if you're a young PhD student, or I think there's a lot of gains to reading outside of economics, and there's a lot of great work. And so I talked about Joseph Henrich, who is an evolutionary anthropologist, essentially. That his work, I think the work he's doing is informing pretty much a lot of the questions that we as economists are asking, and he's using methods that are very rigorous. And so the short answer is there's a huge scope, and huge scope for benefits for economists to talk to those outside of our field. Yeah.
So there's a question over here.
Hi, I'm not a student at UBC, but I found the talk on culture surprising, and I found out a lot of things I didn't realize. And I'm wondering, as being a citizen here in Canada, how this is shaping your view from the research you've done on multiculturalism, which a country like Canada is embracing, and how you see what we've done to create multiculturalism here, and how that affects your viewpoint based on what the research you're finding.
Yeah, no, I think the neat thing about once you're studying culture is you see that all cultures have a logic, right? And there are systematic reasons behind different cultural values and beliefs. So it's very easy to say, this value and belief is different than what we're used to. Ours is right, theirs is wrong. So I think that's one benefit of really just trying to understand culture in a value-free environment. So hopefully, there wasn't a lot of value placed on the research I was doing. It's really like, let's just try and understand the logic. And I think once you can understand the logic of another society and why they do the things the way they are, I think for those that are very resistant to multiculturalism and to integration of different groups, I think that is, it doesn't seem so weird to interact with those of other cultures. And I think the other thing is, one cultural trait is xenophobia, or in-group, out-group bias. So that's a cultural trait that people have been studying, and is obviously related to multiculturalism and all of the crazy, terrible things that are going on in the world today. So, yeah, so I think that's probably one of our most fundamental cultural traits is the desire to form groups and to be really protective and treat those within our group nicely. And so that's great, but you can see that there's also downsides to that. And so this is an important thing to study.
Do you have any observation on what might be inherent in the U.S. culture that makes who pays for healthcare so challenging?
Yeah. Yeah, so I can tell you, believe it or not. So if, and this is all based on research, you can just piece it together. There's a paper by Joe Ferry and Jason Long, basically where they document mobility in the 19th century in different countries. So the US, and probably Canada, although Canada's not in the study, had huge mobility. So if you're born in the poorest 10%, pretty good probability you could get to the 90th percent, especially compared to Britain, right? So huge amounts of mobility. If you look today, perceived mobility is associated with preferences for redistribution. If you perceive mobility to be very high, you don't want redistribution because you think, oh, well, that person could become rich. They're just lazy, right? And that's the American view. So the American view is we're living in the American dream. Anyone can become rich. But that's from the 19th century. If you look at the data today, mobility isn't higher in America than, yeah. And so there's been a few papers. Another paper is by Alberto Alazina, Stephanie Stancheva, and Eduardo Teso, which basically documents this second fact, that today mobility is similar in the US and other countries, but Americans perceive mobility to be higher, and they don't like redistribution for that reason, right? And so I think that's the case. The US, Canada is kind of interesting. I have to think about that more, because I'm sure mobility was high as well in the 18th century, 19th century. But I think that has a lot to do with it, yeah.
So your lecture shed light on cultural differences in many parts of the world. I was just wondering what it is about Nordic values or Nordic culture that make them more likely to support distribution of wealth and the common good and supporting a public infrastructure project?
Nordic, yeah. That's a good question. I don't think I have the answer to that. That's a good paper. So for the PhD students at UBC that were, so what is it about Nordic values? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's that you needed to band together because the climate is particularly hostile and you have these long periods where you can't grow anything. And so whether you needed to band together in communal settings. Nordic places tend to be fishing societies as well, and so whether that causes more community or not, but yeah. So, but yeah, that's a great research question. So.
Many of your examples are out of the country.
Yeah.
Next Monday, my book club is going to be reading the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I'm wondering if, and believe me, there's big economic and cultural issues there. I'm wondering if anybody's doing work in anticipation of this.
So the short, not that I know of. Yeah, not that I know of. So there's definitely not.
That was my suspicion too.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
In a lot of the examples that you gave about the policy implications for this, you're using examples where people are going to design policy in cultures other than their own. So Westerners going into developing country contexts, and then their development interventions failing because they're not taking into account or properly understanding that culture. But I'm wondering if you also see culture affecting how policy is working when policymakers are working within their own culture as well, and using maybe economic models even within their own culture because they're using economic models that aren't taking into account that culture that you'd think that they would sort of understand.
Yeah, so one example is the US, the preferences for redistribution. So if you understand that this is why people are voting this way, it's this gut reaction that we shouldn't redistribute because people are lazy, and that comes from a historical view about mobility, then one thing you could try is, well, let's inform people about what mobility actually looks like, right? So it's only recently we have these matrices where the probability of moving up and down the different distributions. There's another example of a scholar that's looking at why is it in Saudi Arabia that women aren't allowed to work, okay? And what he's finding is if you ask any husband, he says, oh, I'd be fine with my wife working. but everyone else is going to think that's bad. I don't want to be ostracized. But you ask every individual, and they're all fine with women working, but they think others aren't fine with it. So you do have this traditional culture, but people's thinking has changed, but they're just too afraid to voice it. And so really you're stuck in this bad equilibrium, and you just how do you shock everyone and get everyone to realize, oh, no, nobody cares if women work. And so he has some ideas, but that's another case where it's the Saudi government that's kind of supporting this. And he's trying to think of, and there's other cultural traits that people are trying to get rid of. Female genital mutilation is another example. And so governments are trying to think about why do we have this equilibrium? What purpose, if any, does this serve? And then how do we, understanding that logic, help us moving forward? So.
Okay, I think we have one last question here. So make it good.
Well, I'll try to make it short at least.
Okay.
Are there types of cultural contexts that are harder or easier to include in economic models? Basically, can you just put a utility on a belief and stick it in the model, look at different scenarios to help with the decision making then?
Yeah, so that's definitely one way to start, and that's been done. So I don't want to, in some ways I'm providing, as the economists in the audience will know, a bit of a straw man. Like people have done that and realized, oh, well, you can change the utility function and say people get disutility when they beat someone up. Or, and then it's a bit tricky because if someone's beating you up, you actually get utility from fighting back. So you have to take this into account. But that's one way, yeah. So that's the very first thing is, well, okay, well, let's look at different utility functions and see which of those explains behavior. What's missing, I think, is thinking, where do those utility functions come from? So why is it that, and do people in different societies have different utility functions, right? So one thing that's been documented is this culture of honor. So just since I'm talking about fighting, in some societies, it's viewed as very wrong if someone insults you and you don't fight back and you don't beat them up. Or someone insults your mother or your wife, and so this is called a culture of honor. In other societies, it's more like, no, the right thing to do is turn the other cheek, and right. And it turns out there's evidence that this comes from, again, what type of subsistence your ancestors were involved in. And if you're in a herding society, right, where your honor was very important because that kept others from stealing from you, so that showed that you're a really tough guy. Those descendants of those societies tend to have this culture of honor, and others don't, right? And so I think that's what's missing is we can definitely put stuff in the utility function, but where does this come from? And do we observe heterogeneity? And so a big problem now is we have these behavioral experiments, but we're only doing them on our undergraduates or maybe graduates, or maybe we'll get some people from down the street, but it's all just Western societies. And some people really believe, oh, well, we're all the same, so that's fine, we don't need to. But there are others like Joe Henrik, who I talked about, where he's really trying to push people, well, let's actually run these experiments in different parts of the world, then we'll know what these utility functions are they different, we can start to understand where they come from, how quickly do they change, all these sorts of things, right? Yeah, so that's the way I view it.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Nathan, for your comments.
Great, thanks.
Take a round of applause.
Thanks for having me.
And we, as the Department of Economics, would also like to thank some people who have helped us out with this event. SFU Alumni Association, SFU Public Square, for kind of drumming up public interest and really helping us coordinate and organize this entire thing. Thanks also to the Bank of Montreal that provides continued financial support for running this lecture series generally every fall. And then finally, thank you all for showing up as a small token of gesture, appreciation. We do have a reception immediately after this, right outside, so please feel free to continue the discussion. Again, thank you once again, and everyone have a good evening. All right, thanks.